Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Tuesday the 11th of January. I'm Andrew Wilson and this is Scotland at 7. First we will have today's coronavirus update, then I'll introduce this evening's guest, and then together we will discuss today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. As at 2 p.m. today, a total of 4,098,484 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 3,031,456 have been confirmed negative and 1,067,028 have tested positive. There are 10,392 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. These figures being reported are still affected by delays in processing the increased number of tests that have been resulting from the rise in the Omicron variant. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,479 were in hospital last night, 54 of whom were in intensive care. There are 16 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, and that means that the total number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,950. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. The latest UK daily figures show that 150,609 patients tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 379 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,393,689 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. 4,051,635 had received their second dose, and 3,130,502 had received their third or booster dose. Now then, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by a regular contributor, the retired Professor of Media and Politics, and now writer and media commentator, Professor John Robertson. John, a good new year to you. How are you keeping this evening?
I'm well, thank you.
I'm delighted to hear it, and thank you for joining us on Scotland at 7 this evening. Now, firstly, there's the First Minister's COVID update that she gave to the Parliament this afternoon. Large outdoor events can resume without physical distancing or capacity limits from 1 minute past midnight on Monday the 17th of January, following a review of all measures in place to limit the spread of coronavirus. To support the lifting of capacity limits on outdoor events, COVID certification will remain for these where more than 4,000 standing or 10,000 seated are in attendance, and all other events and venues previously covered. Organisers of all events with more than 1,000 attendees will be expected to check a minimum of 50% of attendees for certification of vaccination, exemption, or a negative test. From next Monday, a person will need to show that they have had a booster to be considered fully vaccinated if the last vaccine dose was more than 4 months ago. The NHS Scotland COVID status app will be updated from this Thursday and will include booster jags on the QR code for domestic settings. Updated paper and PDF certificates are already available on request from the NHS Inform website or helpline. The Scottish Cabinet will next review the state of the epidemic on Tuesday the 18th of January and consider whether it may be possible to lift capacity caps on indoor live events, including theatre performances and concerts, from the 24th of January, by which time the impact of the return to schools and workplaces following the festive period should begin to show in the figures. Cabinet will also consider whether COVID certification should be required in a broader range of settings. Local authorities will receive up to £5 million of additional support to ensure ventilation in schools and early year settings meets the latest COVID-19 safety guidance. The funding is to improve airflow, such as adjustments to windows and doors, use of fan systems, and use of air cleaning devices in line with existing safety guidance. This is in addition to the Scottish Government funding of £10 million provided to local authorities for ventilation and CO2 monitoring last year. So, John, we've had another important update from the First Minister to our Parliament this afternoon, and we're seeing a variation in a number of the restrictions and controls that have been in place. But I was keen to talk to you a little bit this evening about the ongoing coverage in the mainstream media of the changes in the restrictions and the way and the performance of the approach of the Scottish Government. And that partially is informed. I heard our good friends at Pacific Key, and in particular the fragrant Kay Adams, referring to Nadim Zahawi as the UK Health Secretary late last week, which at least caused me to stop, and I think a couple of 100,000 Twitter users to comment on it to her. Do you think is there any change, and do you think is the Scottish or UK mainstream media any better capable at reporting the more sophisticated and the more complex set of restrictions that we now see, especially when Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland continue to have different restrictions to England?
Yes, I mean it's hard not to laugh sometimes, and it's a bit confusing at times as to whether it's a problem with numeracy that they have, or whether it's just a kind of a ratty determination to find fault. There have been one or two times over the pandemic when Scotland's figures have been worse. Very, very rarely over the nearly 2 years. Over the whole pandemic, Scotland's infection rate significantly lower and our death rate significantly lower than most of the other parts of the UK. But any little occasion when, due to perhaps the expected curve in the graphs of a pandemic, they find Scotland's infection rate might be higher, and then they jump up and down and shout Nicola Sturgeon's stricter measures didn't work. Now we've already seen that. Well, we've seen that recently, quite dramatically, with regard to the ONS figures. The ONS figures are very clear that the infection rate in Scotland, just after the new measures were introduced on Boxing Day, the infection rates in Scotland were 1 in 20, and in England 1 in 15. Now I know ratios are perhaps a bit of a challenge for some of the Conservative Party, but that's a very clear difference. There's a 30% higher infection rate, 1 in 20 compared to 1 in 15, 33%, and that's 33% of millions of people. Bear in mind, we're not talking about. That's the trouble I think they have. They see 1 in 15 and 1 in 20, and they think, well, what's the difference between 15 and 20? It's not much, but it's 15% of what? Sorry, it's 1 in 15 of millions.
Absolutely, I think the numeracy and the portrayal of complex statistics has often been a problem, but in particular at Pacific Key. I don't know if it's a lack, as you say, a lack of ability or a lack of willingness to bring in people to help with that. One other aspect of the ongoing reporting of the pandemic, it struck me that when the Omicron variant emerged, one of the first respected commentators I saw commentating was Professor Devi Sridhar through here in Edinburgh, who very succinctly and very directly put it that the priorities were to get vaccinated and to protect the NHS. Now, in questioning from a number of commentators on STV in particular this week, I've heard it being made very plain that the point about protecting the NHS, the Scottish NHS, and social care completely passes mainstream media by. No matter how much we talk about the challenges due to a lack of manpower, with staff either self-isolating themselves or caring for family members who have tested positive for COVID, the message with regard to the impact that the pandemic is having on workforces doesn't seem to get through. So what do you think would make a difference to help mainstream media be able to talk about and discuss not just as you say, the infection rates, but also the impact that infection rates has on key services?
Well, I think that the answer is quite a simple one. They should continue to use risk-taking and highly qualified epidemiologists, like as you know, Professor Sridhar, Professor Bald. But the problem with those two, from the point of view of the mainstream media, is that they occasionally say things about the Scottish government's handling of the pandemic. And while they were quite present in the early stages of the pandemic, and they're still quite present in the media in England. They've been replaced by a woman from Grampian, who's no harm to her, is an administrator who probably knows a bit about statistics, but she's not a professor of epidemiology, but she has a great advantage from the point of view of especially reporting Scotland and Good Morning Scotland. She never strays into saying anything positive about the Scottish Government's performance.
That's a very good point, and I'd be the first to admit that Professor Linda Bald still maintains a slot on the BBC on a Saturday morning, and it's as I think in a number of households, it's a highlight of the week to be listening to her and to getting some perspective. In much the same way as I've heard from a number of people over the festive period, the extent to which the appearances and the communications from Professor Jason Leach are a high point in some people's lives in Scotland now. Do you think that also is an indication of people's awareness of either the inadequacy or the partiality of mainstream media reporting in Scotland, that people are actually preferring to listen direct to actual experts?
Yes, I hope that that's getting through. And you mentioned Professor Leach. And we'll leave aside the professor bit. He's a very good communicator. He's an excellent communicator. On a par with the First Minister, and with maybe a bit more kind of life and humour about him as well. I think he's very good, and I think it must be he doesn't hold back. He's prepared in social media, and I think when being interviewed, as are one or two leading SNP politicians recently. It started with Jean Freeman, I think, who started to fight back, and it's clear that Hamza Yousaf's not going to take any fakery in reporting. He will strike back, especially in social media. You feel that must be getting through, that people are starting to see that this naked bias amongst many of the presenters, especially in BBC Scotland, and are getting maybe the full and clear blast of the truth from people like Professor Leach.
Well, oddly, I think David Cameron was being quoted today. I heard with a Cameron quote that I didn't quite remember, which was that truth is the ultimate disinfectant. So it's maybe instructive that we're getting a little bit more of that. I mentioned when I was presenting that story just now that the final item was in connection with additional funding for local authorities in connection with ventilation. Now, I heard a great deal of attention being paid to ventilation in schools on a radio station from Pacific Quay on Sunday morning, and the Cabinet Secretary was being interviewed, and she indicated that whilst ventilation, provision of equipment for ventilation was important, it was not the number one priority. Now, as I say, there was a great deal of attention paid to ventilation in schools on that programme for at least half an hour on Sunday morning. Do you think that's an indication that some campaigning and some lines from the mainstream media in Scotland are still having an effect on Scottish Government policy?
Can I say, first of all, people may have seen me fiddling with my phone there. The volume from you seems to have gone down. I've turned my phone up to full volume, but I'm afraid I can't always hear you, so I didn't fully catch that. It's about ventilation. I mean, I have my own views on that. No surprise there. I think it's an easy target again. It would cost millions to put in the number of filtration units. Not really ventilation; it's more filtration, I think, that's required into schools. It would cost millions and millions. And the fact that that hasn't happened in any part of the UK really is just an easy target for opposition parties to jump up and shout about. I'm not sure it compares much with the use of face coverings as a preventative. I think it probably does help, but if you're, if you ventilate a room, then you move the aerosols around within the room. I mean, I don't know enough about it to have a strong opinion, but I'm a little suspicious that the whole idea of moving these aerosols around the room is going to help. You might actually spread them, I would think.
Absolutely, John. Thank you. That's been a really helpful discussion of the media approach, in particular, to the latest announcements from our First Minister this afternoon, and the ongoing variations and refinement of the restrictions that we're all living under as the pandemic progresses. But we'll move on to our next story now, and that is that the Metropolitan Police have been accused of deferring to the powerful by not investigating Downing Street parties held in apparent breach of lockdown rules. The force on Monday said it was in touch with the Cabinet Office in light of widespread reporting relating to alleged breaches of the health protection regulations at Downing Street on the 20th of May 2020. The police statement came after the leak of an email from one of the Prime Minister's top officials inviting more than 100 Downing Street staff to a Bring Your Own Booze party during the first coronavirus lockdown. The Prime Minister sent the Paymaster General, Michael Ellis, to answer an urgent question by Angela Rayner about the BYOB drinks party on the 20th of May. MP after MP on the opposition benches recounted constituents and personal lockdown tragedies to almost bare government benches. The SNP's Westminster Deputy Leader, Kirsten Oswald MP, said, Tory MPs have a choice to make. They can finally do the right thing and remove Boris Johnson from office, or they will face the wrath of voters at the next general election. People are understandably furious that yet again it's one rule for the Tory elite and another for the rest of us. This Prime Minister is not fit for office. Two damning new polls have revealed that an overwhelming majority of people across the UK believe that Boris Johnson should resign as Prime Minister, following the latest rule-breaking party at Downing Street. A YouGov Sky News poll found that, excluding don't knows, 67% of people across the UK believe that Boris Johnson should resign. In Scotland, the number of people that think Johnson should resign rises to 79%, with only 21% thinking that he should stay on. A separate Savanta Congress survey revealed that 73% of people, excluding don't knows, across the UK think that Johnson should resign, as well as 42% of Tory voters who voted Tory in 2019. So, John, first of all, is it fair to say that the hopes of Tory MPs that the Partygate horror from December last year, which saw the Prime Minister's approval ratings and his electability performance collapse, is it fair to say that that Partygate horror from December last year, were Tory MPs hoping that that would be forgotten in a haze of turkey and sherry, and that those hopes have been dashed by these latest revelations?
Well, you're still a bit quiet for me, so I've had to lean into my phone to hear you at times. I don't know if something can be done about that, but I did hear. Before I come to the Conservative Party and their parties, you spoke about the Met there, and I have to say that I know people in the police force in Ayrshire. One or two. I live in one of these estates for lower paid professionals, and so several of my neighbours are police officers, and they're all utterly horrified by the performance of the leadership of the Met in London. They feel that they're in danger of seriously damaging the respect for which many people in Scotland hold the police force. The Met, and you have to look only really back a few years to various previous scandals. The leadership of the Met is entirely politicised, if not corrupt, and probably both. And they have made enormous mistakes. I mean, the recent policing of the protest, not a protest, the vigil for the murdered woman who was murdered by a policeman. The handling of that, the brutality of that handling, the contrast with the really, really very well done management of the COP26 protests in Scotland, where there were no doubt some Met officers there, but the whole approach was far better. So I think the Met really just fill me with despair. But it's important, I think, to note that police forces in other parts of the UK are far more competent, far more principled than they are. Returning to the Conservative Party and their parties, I mean, I said before you couldn't make it up, but of course you could make it up for this particular group. This is you probably know of a book called The Psychopath Test. I sometimes think that it would be entertaining for all of the members of the Conservative Party at senior levels in government do that. I think we would find maybe Boris is the highest scorer, but I feel also there's a fair chance that several others. These are people who don't think it counts for them, that they are above, and they're above even the laws they develop themselves. So that you have these extremes of people, under tremendous pressure, unable to visit, unable to go to funerals, and at the same time, people like Johnson, but not just him, people like Johnson and many others, who are quite happy to go on as if it doesn't apply to them. I keep thinking, you mentioned the opinion polls, and clearly they are struggling, but they're struggling with 2 years to go before the next election. We've probably been on this issue before, but I feel fairly sure that when it comes to another election, if they're still this low in the polls, and they may be even lower than they are just now, then they will stab Boris in the back and replace him and his coterie of psychopaths with some people who can pretend to be a bit more human. They might, who knows, maybe they'll invite Anna Soubry back.
That's an interesting point. Thinking for a moment about the broader politics of this, and we'll be talking about the Labour Party and its approach to things in a moment. But it struck me that Ian Blackford called for Johnson, called again for Johnson to resign last night. Angela Rayner, as you would expect, didn't miss and hit the wall when she was asking the urgent question this morning. But in terms of the politics, is it in a sense, might it be better for the opposition parties and parties that support independence in Scotland? Would it be better for them to keep Johnson in place? You know, there's an argument that Johnson is the greatest recruiter for independence that we've ever had.
Well, I suppose that does seem likely, going by the opinion polls. He does seem to have helped with the level of support, although far less than I would have hoped for. I mean, we're still neck and neck pretty much, despite Johnson. So I do wonder sometimes if that's been overstated, and maybe it's something that doesn't really have an impact. The kind of people who would be put off by Johnson were probably also put off by Cameron, a milder figure. So I sometimes wonder if there's a kind of there's a point at which it doesn't make any difference who leads the Conservative Party. People are not going to change anyway with regard to them. I've lost the thread of the question there.
That's okay. I can follow it on because I was also going to ask you, because I think it's fair to say that those who voted Conservative in England and Wales, and Scotland perhaps, but also those who avowed to be supporters of Boris Johnson, must have already baked in a great deal of Johnson's peculiar personality into their voting already. So I was wondering, are we starting to edge towards Nixon territory yet, where it's not the people don't so much mind the parties which appear to, on the face of it, to have been in breach of the regulations, and instead it's the denials and the mistruths and the cover-ups that will ultimately pull the rug from under Johnson.
Well, hopefully that's the case. Although I mean it is moving glacially in terms of the polls, and of course we have the worries of the lack of an alternative for people in England to vote for. The problem, I think, one of the major problems with Conservative voters is that, as we've touched on already, they don't care too much about their leadership as long as their leadership wins. That's all that they matter about. And the reason they want to win is not because so much that they identify, although they do sometimes, with Conservative values. They hate what they perceive to be Labour values. And that's what drives much of the voting for the Conservative Party. It's utterly cynical. It's not for anything. It's against any kind of notion of fairness or equality. They can't bear that prospect. And of course, with Starmer and in leadership there, it's not going to matter much anyway, is it? Really, we saw them. I think we're coming to that. I think the abstaining on the benefits vote.
We are. Yes, John. And just one last thing, we saw Liz Truss taking the front page of the Sunday Telegraph on Sunday. We saw Michael Gove making an important announcement with regard to flammable cladding on buildings yesterday. I wondered whether you perceive that the sound of political knives being sharpened in the cabinet meeting room, whether that the sound of those knives being sharpened is increasing at all.
Well, I mean, it's difficult to tell if it really is or whether it's just media interest at times. I mean, opinion polls don't show Gove or Truss. It's an interesting combination of names, Gove and Truss. I certainly wouldn't go to those lawyers. They perform very poorly in the opinion polls. I know people can come from the back and source through, I mean, as Cameron did, but I think it's always in the offing. And if there were to be a real nosedive in the polls, especially as we got into the year before the next election, or if there was an election going to be called for some reason, though it seems like unlikely, then I think perhaps someone like Truss might come through. I think Gove is probably not likable enough to actually make a surge. He's allegedly a clever man, but I think there's something very off-putting about him. So Truss not much better, but she's a woman, so maybe they might think they would get somewhere with her.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Well, undoubtedly, as you say, we'll come back to looking a little bit more at the performance of the Labour Party in a few minutes. But for now, what we'll do is we'll move on because support for social care is to be intensified as a national priority alongside the NHS and emergency services, as staffing pressures and increased demand reflect the extent and nature of the spread and effect of Omicron. As a result of staffing availability due to COVID, the Scottish Government and COSLA, working with local partners across the public services in Scotland, have agreed a joint approach to maximise social care support to ensure that people receive the care they need with dignity and human rights are upheld, and to avoid further pressure falling on the Scottish NHS. Some local public services report that pressure is very significant, with some health and social care partnerships being asked to prioritise capacity and identify staff who can be redeployed to sustain and maintain support for some of the most vulnerable people in society. This might mean that some other services are temporarily paused or reduced to redeploy capacity and expertise. So, John, today John Swinney has spoken about this being, in his words, one of the most difficult periods we have faced in the pandemic, because the absence rate from public and private services is growing. And I got a text this morning from the Red Cross looking for volunteers to help backfill with administration for the vaccination programme and with delivering test kits. Is there an undercurrent here, do you think, perhaps, that things are actually pretty serious, but at the same time there's an attempt in the messaging nowadays not to frighten the horses, perhaps because the horses are now beyond frightening after 2 years of a pandemic?
Look at me, clearly this ageing population, including me, this ageing population presents an enormous challenge for the rest of society. You know, the baby boomers are still an enormous group, and of course we're living longer. So the pressures on the health service and on the care system are huge. And there doesn't seem an obvious solution other than to invest significantly, in particular in the care homes, where we've had a system based on the profit motive for many, and on low pay and insecure employment, and therefore difficulty in actually getting a good staff to stay. So obviously there has to be increased investment. It doesn't seem likely that the UK government will actually want to go down that road. So that's another reason why independence is something that's required if we're to actually develop the kind of society we want to have. In terms of scaring the horses, I'm sure you're right that there'll be. It's not something that certainly the UK government would want to see much more discussion of in the mainstream media, because it is such a challenge for them. Another way of investment, I said, is clearly something we have to do in this. There's no other way around that. But the other thing, of course, was we have to free up the movement of workers. The health service in the UK, across the UK, was very dependent on EU citizens in particular, skilled and capable people, often paid less than they should be paid, and a huge number of them have gone home. No wonder in this hostile environment. I can't see how, with the birth rate we have and with the slowing death rate that we have, I can't see any other way around that we allow people to move from more populous parts of the world and enable the system to operate. The alternative is disaster, crisis.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. And also in this story, the joint statement by the Scottish Government and COSLA this afternoon says, "We remain committed to maintaining in-person learning in schools and early learning because closing schools is harmful to children and would have a negative effect on the wider economy and public services." Now, I understand that point, and obviously the opening and closing and the management of schools has been an acutely political point of contention during the pandemic. But in terms of the closing schools being harmful to children, I understand that point, but to what extent is that correct? I mean, there's not an argument that it's more harmful to a young person if their parent or grandparent or carer or sibling dies of COVID.
Yes, I mean, that's an area. This is an area in which I have a particular interest. I was in schools myself as a teacher, and then in teacher education for quite a long time, between 2 and 3 decades. It's been a while since then, so people might argue I'm past my sell-by date. But during that time, I was a bit of a skeptic of the extent to which the classroom is a sacred place. You know, the place in which some learning takes place that cannot take place anywhere else. There is a great deal of evidence which has been developed, I suppose, since the beginning of the Open University in the 1960s, and carried out by researchers across the spectrum, that some of the most effective ways to learn are not with another human being telling you what to do and monitoring and controlling the pace, in particular, the pace of learning. There's a great deal to be achieved if it's properly funded and the materials are good quality, and we know the Open University can do this, good quality materials. Then there's evidence that other kinds of approaches can be at least as successful as the classroom-based approach, and perhaps more so. And I think what we need to do, rather than well, as well as trying to do something about the situation in classroom, making that feasible, because I agree there are things to be gained from classroom learning, but to put a bit of money here into a system which is already quite well staffed, put a bit of money into developing high quality learning materials that can be used across all of Scotland's, especially secondary schools, but perhaps upper primaries as well, and to enable children to learn independently at their own pace. And I think then do a bit of research into that and just see how important it was.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. I knew you'd have an informed and an informing perspective on that story in particular. Thank you. The SNP has said that the Labour Party let down the UK's working class after abstaining on last night's vote on the welfare cap. The decision, which will limit the amount the UK government can spend on certain social security benefits and tax credits, was voted through in the House of Commons last night, with only 14 Labour MPs voting against the motion alongside the SNP. The decision comes at a time when the UK battles a toxic concoction of Tory cuts, tax hikes, soaring inflation and energy bills. Commenting, the SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thulis MP said, "One has to question what the point of the Labour Party is if they fail to vote down a welfare cap which directly impacts the lowest earners in our society. As the UK faces a Tory-made cost of living crisis, it is the duty of the opposition to fight for those who are being directly affected. However, yet again, the Labour Party are posted missing and continue to let down the UK's working class." She continued, "Separately, the UK government's decision to vote in favour of this cap is nothing short of scandalous. It is disgraceful that once again the Tories are trying to balance the books on the backs of those on the lowest incomes." So, John, as Alison Thulis asks, not particularly rhetorically, just what is the point of the Labour Party nowadays, either at Westminster or Holyrood, or for that matter, on local councils?
The Labour Party has done this in the past, of course. They have sat on their hands at other times, rather than fight for the conditions of many of their own voters. I was in Cumnock today, visiting and walking my very young grandson through Cumnock, and I passed a little statue, a very modest statue, and a plaque to another Keir, not a Sir Keir this time, but Keir Hardie, for younger viewers, the founder of the Labour Party. And I can remember wondering, when I looked at it, I remember wondering what he would think of Sir Keir Starmer. He would be horrified, I would imagine, that someone like Keir Starmer his parents thought it appropriate to give him Keir Hardie's name. As Alison Thulis has pointed out, it is hard to understand. The Labour Party leadership, of course, will say we're ahead in the polls now. They are ahead in the polls. I mean, you have to say it's taken a bit of effort by the Conservative Party to enable them to get ahead in the polls. And we now have a situation in the UK, not in Scotland, but a situation in the UK where people have virtually no choice. I mean, the Lib Dems offer them nothing either. There is no leftist party of any strength. The Greens are weak there. In Scotland, I mean, people are very lucky. We have the SNP is clearly a left-of-centre party, not a radical left-of-centre party, perhaps. The Greens are a bit more radical left-of-centre. So at least people have something to vote for here. But it's a nauseating situation in England, I have to say.
I was going to ask you a little bit more about that as well as it happens. It struck me that capping welfare, there's no way that capping welfare will make a significant difference to the Westminster government's budget. So I was wondering what you thought was going on here. Perhaps is it nothing more than signalling to the Tory base in the home counties, and perhaps in Miltimber, Ravelston, and leafy Bears Den, that it's still the poor who are the enemy and that they deserve to be punished.
Yeah, I think you're right. There still are these sort of Victorian values held amongst many members of the Conservative Party and amongst several of their prominent politicians. There will be an element, of course, as you say, of signalling to their electorate that they're not going to be soft on these people who they like to characterise as somehow feckless rather than suffering in any way. I mean, there's also the economic argument, and again, I've been on a few times here, so maybe I'm in danger of repeating myself. But all the evidence, not just my opinion, all the evidence is if you give a little more money to the least well-off in society, they will spend every penny of it. They won't save it so that it lies around useless and the economy doesn't benefit from it. They will spend it in shops, and that will enable other people to get jobs. I think this is a fairly old economic model now, which probably derives from somebody I can't name at the moment, but come back to me. That the idea that it's a cost is just stupid. You give the poor more money, they spend it, and it boosts the economy and boosts jobs, opportunities, and so on. It's just wrong-headed economics, I think.
Absolutely, and it's astonishing that after 12 years of Tory austerity, that the ability to compare the Cameron and coalition government's economic damage with other Western economies who went through the same banking crisis, that the message hasn't got through yet it never ceases to amaze me. But what we will do is we'll move on to our next story now, which is that an SNP.
Can I just interject?
Yes, John, of course.
I was just going to interject there. I've remembered the name of the economist, not the name that one of my students once gave me, where they thought the economist who had that view that if you reward the poor with a bit more income, they will spend it and that will boost the economy. They thought his name was Milton Keynes, which is of course the town, rather than Maynard Keynes, the actual economic theorist who was tremendously influential back in the 1940s.
Of course, absolutely. Not at all, but I've returned to Keynesian economics. I think a number of us would. Well, anyway, we'll leave that for the moment. That would be a whole other programme. But an SNP MP has slammed the UK government after new national grid figures revealed Scottish generators will be unfairly penalised and forced to pay £465 million a year in transmission charges by 2026-27. While England and Wales will be handed a subsidy of £30 million a year. It follows industry concerns that Scottish renewables firms pay huge fees to connect to the national grid, while equivalent English projects are paid to connect to the very same grid. Branded the Great Scottish Renewables Robbery by Stephen Flynn MP, the Westminster government currently forces Scottish generators to pay the highest transmission charges in Europe, with these new figures from the national grid confirming just how reliant on Scottish fees the UK government is. The UK government has so far refused to use its powers under Section 185 of the Energy Act 2004 to cap transmission charges in areas where they are hindering investment in the renewable energy generation, despite various reports that have cited these bloated rates as the barrier to renewable expansion. In the House of Commons today, the SNP Shadow Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy spokesperson said Tory Minister Greg Hands was refusing to take action to deliver fairness in the system because revenues from Scottish generators are too valuable to Westminster as they subsidise England and the entire national grid. Now, John, you blogged about this earlier today, I think, or maybe last night. Is what we're seeing here anything more than yet another example of how Scotland subsidises England?
It seems one of the clearer examples. It's a tremendously clear example here, and it's also kind of shocking, I suppose, that England and Wales and Northern Ireland depend on gas importation and sometimes electricity transfers from Europe, and then when they look north and they realise they can get the same thing within the same country, as you point out, a surcharge is applied to that. So Scotland has the opportunity to, as you say, to power much of England, to light many of England's homes, but has to pay extra for the privilege. And as you pointed at the beginning, it's upside down economics, and its only effect is actually to stifle investment in energy generation in Scotland.
Thanks, John. We'll move on now from UK politics for a little moment, because Sir Andy Murray has welcomed Novak Djokovic's release from immigration detention, but he anticipates that the men's world number one will have a number of questions to answer in the coming days if he chooses to remain in Australia. Djokovic spent his first full day of freedom focusing on tennis matters as he took to Melbourne's Rod Laver Arena behind closed doors for much needed practice after the best part of 5 days spent in a hotel room fighting the cancellation of his visa. Off court, however, his status remained in limbo as Australia's Immigration Minister, Alex Hawke, continued to deliberate over whether to exercise his reserve powers and attempt for a second time to deport the Serbian, while fresh questions arose over the accuracy of Djokovic's travel documents. There was no response from the Djokovic camp either, following increasing attention on the positive PCR test from the 16th of December, on which he relied to obtain a medical exemption to travel, and his apparent maskless appearances in public and social media posts shortly after that date. As the players began to speak about Djokovic's detainment, Murray said that it was positive to see Djokovic win his hearing, but he believes that there are still issues to be resolved. So, John, a Hungarian player has been one of the first players to publicly disagree with Djokovic's presence in Australia. Marton Fucsovics, who's 29, described Djokovic as the greatest player in the sport and underlined his respect for him. He said, however, that we must not go beyond what is happening in the world now. He was speaking with M1, which is a Hungarian TV channel, and he said people's health is paramount. And there are rules that were outlined months ago, namely that everyone should vaccinate themselves, and Djokovic didn't. From this point of view, I don't think he would have the right to be here. Now, John, is it a surprise, thinking of the sporting aspect of this, rather, the sport aspect of this for a moment, is it a surprise that other tennis players, Djokovic's opponents in this competition, are beginning to question his behaviour?
Well, no, it's not a surprise. I mean, tennis is, like some other sports, is of course a very individualist sport, and it may be that the kind of experience they have, and perhaps the kind of people they are before they join the sport, suggests that they might not do too well in the psychopath test either, along with conservative politicians. I suspect Djokovic feels that the laws don't apply to him. He's somehow above them. He may have been reading some crazy websites about the dangers of vaccines. I read somewhere that top sports people are very, very anxious about their bodies, that they worry about the slightest threat that might be apparent to their bodies because they rely on their bodies for their achievement. So maybe he's a bit kind of a bit disturbed in some ways by the reports that he's read, but there is no excuse. And I think the issue now probably is for the Australians is the quality of his documentation, because we have seen one or two little bits of evidence where he attends to the day after his positive test, I beg your pardon, the day after his positive test, he attends some kind of prize giving in Belgrade wearing no mask. I'd be very suspicious. I also find it quite disturbing to watch some of the displays of people of Serbian origin living in Australia. And I know this has happened before, where Serbian and Croatian tennis players have attracted crowds more vociferous than we would get for an old firm game. But some of the protesters, leaving aside the Serbian flags, I saw more than one wearing hats of a military type. And I thought, I've seen those hats before. And they were the kind of hats that were commonly worn by Ratko Mladic, General Ratko Mladic, who is now in prison for war crimes. And I thought, if that's the nature of support for a tennis player, fair enough waving the national flag, but wearing a hat that represents some kind of war criminal. And I think the man who's responsible for Srebrenica is the person in question. So the whole thing's become incredibly politicized there. I know I think Djokovic's father claimed that this was some kind of discrimination against Serbs altogether. As far as I know, the Australians and the Serbs have always been on the same side in wars. So it's, but the main view I have of this is we're getting far too much about it. It doesn't strike me as that important, a single tennis player either being rejected or not being rejected from a sporting event. I mean, who cares?
Well, that's a very good point, and I was going to ask you about that. Before I do that, I'll say certainly the genocidal murderer Ratko Mladic came up on the Full Scottish yesterday, and whilst on the one hand it's always intensely depressing to be remembering the atrocities for which he was held responsible, but by the same token, it's probably important that we don't forget his name, especially in light of some of the activities in Republika Srpska, where there's either a genocide denial and or there is now graffiti-based support for Ratko Mladic. So always happy to bring it back, bring his name back to the fore, so long as it's in the correct context, which you did there, John. Thank you. But yes, more generally, the way in which this story has continued to dominate the headlines, it's starting to feel a little deliberately overblown to me, perhaps. After all, as you say, Djokovic is definitely not Rosa Parks, but with a much better forehand. He's a multimillionaire tennis player. So why do you think this has been dominating the news agenda so much for days? Am I being overly cynical to think that it's Murdoch and others helping Johnson and other bad actors to manage the front pages?
I think, well, obviously there's always that possibility that the media are drawn to stories like this. I don't think there's a conspiracy involved to distract from Johnson, but I think it's part of the culture really in Western corporate media that they have managed to entertain the masses with celebrity figures, and I think we've got many of the members of the population addicted to stories like that. So the media will say, well, no, it's in the public. People want to know about this. We've done surveys. They want to know about this kind of story. They're not bored by it. It's just you lefty intellectuals that don't like it. So I don't know. It just seems like one of the many negative consequences of the kind of corporate media that we have dominating the scene these days.
Absolutely, John. Either bread and circuses or Orwell's beer and gambling. But we'll move on to the next story, because Germany will need increasing migration to prevent severe labour shortages from undermining productivity and endangering a successful energy transition. Its economic minister said, as Europe's largest economy faces a demographic crisis. We have 300,000 job openings today and expect that to climb to 1 million and more, Robert Habeck, a leader of the Green Party, told a news conference. If we don't close that gap, we will have real productivity problems. The employer-friendly German Economic Institute estimates that the labour force will shrink by more than 300,000 people this year, as there are more older workers retiring than younger ones entering the labour market. This gap is expected to widen to more than 650,000 by 2029, leaving an accumulated shortage of people of working age by 2030 of roughly 5 million people. The number of Germans in employment grew to nearly 45 million in 2021, despite the coronavirus pandemic. After decades of low birth rates and uneven immigration, a shrinking labour force poses a demographic time bomb for Germany's public pension system, in which fewer employees are burdened with the task of financing the pensions of a growing mass of retirees who are enjoying longer life expectancy. The governing parties agreed in their coalition negotiations to lower the hurdles for skilled workers from abroad and make working more attractive again, with various measures, including lifting the national wage to 12 euros per hour. So, John, firstly, should we be surprised that the German approach to labour shortages is to get organised? Habeck said, we have to organise this. Whereas in Westminster, the hostile environment is, if anything, being stepped up. And there is certainly no organised approach that I can see to labour shortages that are arising due to Brexit and COVID before we even talk about the demographics.
I think one of the differences is that the political parties in Germany have not politicised the need for migration and the need for a younger workforce in the same way that UK parties would immediately do that, would weaponise the story. And they have weaponised it in the past. And that's why we're in the situation we are just now. after Brexit with shortages in particular, and as we discussed, health and care. It's a short time. It's a short time since Angela Merkel was criticised severely for allowing so many migrants. I think about a million migrants came into Germany in the space of a year or so, and one or two of them, young men, were found to have unacceptable attitudes towards women, and there were some cases of rape and attempted rape. In terms of the million arriving, the number of cases of rape was quite small, although each incident unacceptable. But the Germans pragmatically then made the decision, and I suppose when we say the Germans, we're talking about the German political elite and their industrial backers, decided that was the solution for the economy. I have mixed feelings about it, but it's clear that the same situation persists here, that Scotland, and especially Scotland, but other parts of the UK too, really has no choice with its ageing profile but to allow in, and so I don't know how our parties will react to that. It's fairly clear that Labour won't break away from the Conservatives' position of protecting our borders and keeping out undesirables. So it's difficult to see what's going to happen here. Clearly, after independence, Scotland might have a slightly more liberal approach to that, but it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable. This is one of these bigger trends, which individual politicians or parties can't really do anything about. When populations start to move, they move, and they're almost irresistible, that movement, because we've created a kind of vacuum into which they're drawn.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. And we'll move now to our final story this evening, which is that new remote monitoring tools to support people with COVID to stay safely at home and to free up hospital beds are among a range of steps being put in place to support the health and care workforce and to maximise capacity. Measures include £500,000 to fund 25,000 remote monitoring kits, which include additional pulse oximeters, and a dedicated team which will support the early identification of patients who would benefit from antiviral treatment and get these started as soon as possible. This is intended to free up beds in acute hospitals. COVID admissions are rising at a rate 45% faster than they did last winter, and this, combined with existing winter pressures, is creating significant demand on hospitals. A large spike in staff absence relating to COVID is also significantly impacting NHS service provision. In addition to the investment in remote monitoring, the Scottish Government will also expand existing programmes, including hospital at home, outpatient parenteral antimicrobial therapy services for managing infections, and community respiratory pathways. These services allow patients to be treated in their own homes and to receive the relevant treatment without admission to hospital. So, John, I first heard about some of this last week when someone was talking about virtual medical wards, and I didn't know what that meant. Now, I know that technology has become a much bigger part of many of our lives during the pandemic. What do you think about the increased use of the amount of technology in people's homes that we're now expecting to see specifically in healthcare? And do you think, is there any risk of digital exclusion or of sectors of the community being less able or less skilled in using increased amounts of technology in the context of their healthcare?
I think that's always a risk, but it does seem to be an intelligent response to the situation to protect hospitals against overcrowding, against being overwhelmed. I mean, clearly, minor cases. Well, maybe I don't know if I'm using the correct term here, but there are people infected with COVID who feel bad enough to want to go into hospital, but that's partly because they have no alternative. If they want to access treatment, they have to go into hospital. I suppose so. If that is more freely available to be used in the home, then I think we could work our way towards a situation as part of the move towards an endemic situation rather than a pandemic one, where people treat themselves or are looked after by their close relatives. I don't think that's a cop-out. I think there's scope in that. It clearly has to be done in a sensible way, and we want to make sure that the GPs are in a position, of course, I think, to judge the situation and to maybe give a second opinion as to whether somebody should be treated at home, is capable of being treated at home, or whether the support mechanisms aren't there and they have no choice but to go into hospitals, and we deal with the kind of inequalities that you've mentioned.
Thanks, John. And that was our final item this evening. In making these programmes brought Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. We really need all the financial assistance that we can get in order to do more of what we do. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here again at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in. I'd like to say thank you to Professor John Robertson for joining us, and in particular for reminding us of John Ronson's psychopath test and John Maynard Keynes' general theory. Thanks, John.
My pleasure.
And also thanks to everyone else for watching us on Broadcasting Scotland. Before I go, I need to do one thing, which is to wish a very happy birthday to Christopher, who is 10 today. He's another regular contributor to our programme. Many happy returns, Christopher. But having said all of that, thank you for joining us this evening on Scotland at 7. I hope that everybody keeps warm and keeps well. Bye-bye.